Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Indivisible, New Jersey 4th District 2nd Citizens Town Hall. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for coming out. My name is Kevin Akey. I'm a member of the steering committee of Indivisible, New Jersey 4th. I'm going to take care of a couple of housekeeping items before I turn the program over to Dan. So we're going to begin with the pledge. So will those of you who are able to stand, please stand. And for those of you who feel in your conscience you cannot do this, please, we ask that you be respectful. Flag is to my right or left. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much. Well, what a surprise. Congressman Smith is not here tonight. How about that? Oh, it is a shame. But if you didn't notice these as you came in, you can pick them up during, if you want to take a break during the evening or on your way out. We have postcards all ready to go. Just write a little love note to Congressman Smith. Let him know that we're thinking of him tonight, and we wish that he was thinking about us even more than he doesn't already do. So you can send him a little note on this. We'll mail it for you. It's a great way to continue the dialogue we have with him by virtue of mail and other things. I've been asked to give a disclaimer, which I think is important. So, and if you'll bear with me, I'm going to read it so I don't mess it up. So, you know we're going to have some questions asked tonight of our expert panelists. So, all questions being asked at tonight's town hall meeting were prepared independently by constituents of New Jersey's 4th Congressional District. A speaker responding to a constituent's question should not be construed as agreement with the views expressed by the questioner. The speaker's participation in tonight's town hall meeting should not be construed as a positive or negative endorsement of any elected official, political candidate, or political party. Many of our speakers are appearing tonight in their personal capacities. Any views expressed by a speaker should be assumed to be his or her own and do not necessarily reflect the views of their organizations. Okay, so that's important to bear in mind. Now, now it's my little turn. I'd like to again welcome you all, both those who are here, those who are watching the live stream at home via YouTube. And I want to take a moment at the very beginning to thank all of you for coming here, all of you for watching at home, and especially to the steering committee and the members of Indivisible New Jersey 4th who did unbelievable work. They gave generously, tirelessly to make this event happen. This is really something that's beyond anything we could have imagined back in January when three of us decided to get together and see what we could do to shake things up a little bit. It is remarkable. So thank you for being here and thank you for your continued attention. And to Congressman Smith, on the off chance that you are watching from home in Herndon, Virginia, or your staff members are watching in on our live feed, I would like to say this to you. Look at who is present tonight. Look around at the constituents here gathered to listen to speakers talk about what you don't have the courage to talk to us about. These are the people you are afraid of. Do we really scare you that much? I don't think you should be afraid of us. Sure, we may ask you very difficult questions. We may boo you. We may call you bad names. But you need to get over that. We haven't talked to you in over 24 years. That must be a modern-day congressional record. So the next time we do this, Congressman Smith, what we're asking you to do is put on your big boy pants, lace up your big boy shoes, and take the microphone and talk to the constituents that you haven't selected for a lovely photo op. Get here and talk to us. Thank you. I'll turn this over to my friend Dan. He'll take it from here. Thank you, one and all.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Kevin. My name is Dan Ribbett. I'm a member of the steering committee as well of Indivisible New Jersey 4th District. To piggyback off of what Kevin said, I want to thank all of you for being here tonight and all of you for participating in the Indivisible movement. The first part of our program is entitled Protecting Democracy. And the idea for this came from the theory that the Trump administration is doing things that are unprecedented in going against democracy. And some of those things briefly include ethics, refusal to divest from his businesses, which is a possible violation of the Emoluments Clause, Russian interference in our elections, and overall orders and policies which violate our democratic norms. So we're going to be starting off with a video from this video is basically answering questions that several constituents sent in. Myself, along with Eileen McAfee, Ronnie Daldos, Norma Rosenblum, and Liz DeBeer, wrote in with specific questions for Congressman Smith about Russia's influence on the Trump administration. Articles have appeared in Politico and the Asbury Park Press about Congressman Smith's allegation that the United States has improperly interfered with elections in Macedonia, and how Congressman Smith's allegations have been utilized by the Russia's state-run media as proof of its longstanding claim that the U.S. interferes with elections all the time. If Congressman Smith were here, perhaps he could shed some light on his views about Russia's interference with our presidential election and potential influence on the Trump administration, and his views on American influence in Eastern European democracies. Since Smith is not here, we've asked Dan Kellerman, professor of political science at Rutgers and an expert in European politics, to provide us with some further explanation of these issues. So here's the video.
Hi, I'm Daniel Kellerman, professor of political science and director of the Center for European Studies at Rutgers. Well, I'm an expert on European politics in particular. The first thing to say is we still have to wait for definitive findings from inquiries which are ongoing, both two sets of inquiries in Congress and then separate inquiries going on with the FBI. So we can't offer definitive answers yet. So what would the Kremlin stand to gain by influencing the most recent presidential election? Well, in addition to those specific reasons, which we've heard about from our intelligence community, there's also the general issue that they just want to make American democracy look bad, to sort of discredit the democratic process, to, in a way, breed a kind of cynicism that, oh, democracy doesn't really work, elections, you can't trust them, you can't trust anything, because he really wants to delegitimize democracy as a regime type, precisely because he's not a Democrat. I mean, he's this authoritarian ruler, and so he wants to make our system look bad. You know, on the question of whether America under a Trump administration could devolve into some kind of quasi-authoritarian regime, I think some of the reasons that people have been worried, quite rightly I think, worried about that is that they'd seen during the campaign and the initial weeks of the administration very worrying sounding statements from the candidate or then the president, attacking the media, criticizing opponents, threatening Hillary Clinton with jail, for instance, during the campaign, criticizing the judiciary with his so-called judge comments, things like that. So these are all some of the hallmarks of these kind of demagogic or populist, sometimes called politicians, who we've seen in a number of countries around the world come to power through elections, but then once in power, gradually erode the democratic system through attacking the free press, attacking the independent judiciary, and skewing the playing field through things like voter suppression tactics, so that the next time around when elections are held, they aren't quite free and fair, and then you get to this tilted playing field where the regime can kind of keep itself in power. Now, myself, I have some confidence that won't happen in our country, and I certainly hope it won't, but it's something we certainly need to guard against and be wary of. Well, I think some people are taking our response to the gas attacks in Syria with our missile strike there as evidence somehow that this shows that couldn't have been collusion or there couldn't have been Russian influence because we're doing something that Russia doesn't approve of in Syria. I think that's the wrong conclusion to reach. I think they're two separate issues. Whatever motivations there were for the strike on Syria, I don't think we can read backwards into that anything that would explain what happened in the past with collusion or not. I'm not an expert on Macedonian politics per se, and I'm not going to try to dig into the details there, but I think the important thing is to put it in a bit bigger context of the increasing tensions between some congressional Republicans and the foundations and philanthropic activities of George Soros. And I think the thing to understand there is that for many of them, they primarily see Soros through a domestic lens, where he and his foundations have been big funders of liberal, primarily democratic causes and candidates here in the US. But I think then they've been projecting that over into Eastern Europe, right? And sort of viewing him as a funder of liberal causes, leftist, progressive causes in Eastern Europe, and thinking, no, if it's funded by Soros, it must just be a liberal cause and we need to be against it, when actually he's just trying to promote their democracy. I think that's a kind of misguided view of things to project that into Eastern Europe, because really it's actually a bit bizarre, because conservatives in a way championed historically a lot of the things Soros was doing in the region. Soros was a big champion in the fight against communism in the tail end, helping support dissidents and whatnot. And then as those countries transitioned to democracy after the collapse of communism, he stepped in with his philanthropic activities to fund a huge range of activities to promote democracy, to promote the transition to and consolidation of democracy in the region. And that's still what he's doing there. The other aspect of Soros in Eastern Europe we have to understand connects with Russia, actually. There's a real battle going on between liberal pluralist democracy that the European Union and Western European countries are trying to champion, and then autocracy, which Putin is trying to export from Russia to be a model in more governments in Eastern Europe. And there's that kind of competition going on there, and he sees Soros and his NGOs as enemies in that competition, as promoters of this kind of liberal democracy. And so therefore, Russia is dead set on pushing out Soros-affiliated NGOs and educational institutions from the region. When you see a politician like Donald Trump, who has a lot of the demagogic rhetoric, is doing attacks on the press, on the judiciary, on the sort of traditional institutions of American democracy, one of my biggest worries then is, could he pose a threat to our traditional institutions and our democratic system? And then the other thing that's intertwined with that is this kind of Russiagate controversy. Was there collusion in the campaign, with forces of a regime, the Russian regime, which are of course totally opposed to our way of government? If I could speak to a member of our Congress and ask them to act about those concerns that I just voiced, I think there'd be two things that I'd ask them. One, I'd ask them to speak out forcefully in defense of traditional American democratic institutions, those institutions such as freedom of the press, right, independence of the judiciary and commitment to the rule of law, and freedom to protest and dissent, etc., against the government, and really to defend those values if and whenever the president might make comments or tweets that sound like they're attacking those values. So I think it's important that they do that. And then secondly, on the whole Russiagate controversy, I would ask them to back an independent inquiry into exactly what happened, so that we can know and so that we can make sure nothing like that could happen again.
All right. Hopefully he's watching from home, but let's thank Professor Kellerman for lending us his expertise. So when we selected the topics for the town hall, it was overwhelming how many of you had questions about international politics. Russia, Putin, definitely questions about that Asbury Park article. What is our congressman doing worrying about Macedonia? And so, again, we wish that he were here to answer these questions for himself, but we're fortunate to be able to have some folks who are willing to jump in and pitch it for him. So we've gone from the international, and we're going to bring it down to the national, and to continue in this vein of answering your questions about protecting democracy, I am pleased to introduce our first live guest to help field some of those questions. Dr. Gerald Pomper is a Board of Governors Professor of Political Science Emeritus at the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. He's a specialist in American politics and elections, and he's the author or editor of 21 books, including Passions and Interests, Elections in America, Voters' Choice, and Negative Campaigning. He's educated at Columbia and Princeton, and Dr. Pomper has taught at Tel Aviv University, Oxford, Australian National University, and Northeastern, and he's been at Rutgers for 50 years. His civic activities include 8 years on his local Board of Education, including 2 years as president, membership on his local zoning board and the borough's redevelopment authority. He's run summer institutes for high school teachers, evaluations for New Jersey's former Department of Higher Education, and he serves as the chair of the Free Speech Committee of the American Civil Liberties Union. He is right now president of the Middlesex County chapter of CASA of New Jersey, a child advocacy organization, and I'm very pleased that he agreed to lend his expertise and his voice tonight. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Jerry Pomper.
Thank you very much.
Can everybody hear? Excellent. So, Professor, I've been instructed that anyone over the age of 21 must address him as Jerry, so I'll do my best, although it's really hard for me not to address him as Professor or Dr. Pomper. But
Just barely past 20.
just barely. When you and I first talked, you responded immediately to our invitation to come speak. And if you could, with your opening comments, explain why. Why were you so eager to come speak with an Indivisible group?
Well, basically, I'm here because of Donald Trump. He brought me in. He did that in 2 ways. I write a chapter or sometimes a book on each presidential election, and you try and get this going as early as you can. So while the campaign was still going on, I had written the first couple of paragraphs of my chapter on the presidential election, and they emphasized the election of the first woman president and the restoration of the Democratic Party majority, et cetera, et cetera. And then Donald Trump screwed it up for me, and I had to tear it all up and begin from the beginning. So I have a personal grievance. The more serious thing is that I do regard him, I'm not supposed to make partisan comments?
Well, you can say them as an individual, but you're not saying it on behalf of Rutgers, if that makes sense.
No. And I worry very seriously about the Trump administration as a threat to the democratic process, going far beyond any specific policies that I have in mind. And the chapter is written around a comparison of the election of Trump and Julius Caesar, Shakespeare's play. And I think there are some frightening parallels between the death of the Roman Republic with the assassination of Caesar and the creation of the Roman Empire and the election of Trump. We'll come back to some of that. Those are the reasons I'm here.
So now we have pulled some questions that were submitted from the constituents of the 4th District. Before Dan reads that, is Greg DeLuca here? Greg? Okay. Only a few folks offered to come and read their questions themselves. So for those who are camera shy, Dan's going to be helping me out with moderating and reading their questions for them.
Okay, so here's Greg's question. In addition to all the important legislative issues facing our country, there is a long-term threat that must be addressed. While repeatedly calling our electoral process rigged, Trump has also peddled completely false conspiracy theories about voter fraud, paid protesters, etc. Congressman Smith endorsed the idea of, in quotation marks, paid agitators during a radio interview, and fake stories about voter fraud will simply be used to drum up support for discriminatory voter ID laws. So Jerry, what are the short and long-term threats to voting rights and other civil rights in this environment, and what are the implications?
I think Greg has posed the central question of this administration. I think this is the most serious concern I have and the most serious threat. We can deal with policy issues, and we can sometimes lose and sometimes win. But if we lose the democratic process itself, we can't correct those positions, we can't correct the policies. Now, this is not a matter of Donald Trump as an individual. In some ways, he's irrelevant here. I think this is a longer-term threat, and if Donald Trump decided to retire tomorrow, we'd still have Attorney General Sessions, and we have other kinds of threats. So I look at fundamental structural matters. I'm very concerned about the long-term effects of the Supreme Court's decisions. Its decision in 2010 called Citizen United, which opened the floodgates of spending and contributions, unlimited essentially contributions, including contributions from corporations. And I worry about their decision, which has essentially declared the Voting Rights Act of 1965 inoperable, although not unconstitutional as such. And meanwhile, state legislatures, almost all, in fact, Republican-controlled, have been attempting to limit voting access by passing laws that are supposedly anti-fraud measures, but which require all kinds of identification for people to vote and make challenges easy and taking people off the rolls. Those same state legislatures, of course, are in charge of districting and redistricting, and we get situations where states have almost equal numbers of Democratic and Republican votes, and they end up with congressional representation of 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 Republican because of gerrymandering. So I worry about that. Now, situation isn't as bad as it could get. In some ways, voting turnout or voting has become easier over the last decade or two. We didn't have early voting 20 years ago. Now it's current throughout the country. And we've had an increase in voting, and of course we've had the ending of legal discrimination. Courts have become more active in examining these voter ID fraud laws and in examining districting and gerrymandering. And so there have been some advances. And I think one of the few encouraging things about the election of 2016 was how easy it turned out to raise money. Bernie Sanders, hardly a rich person, raised this huge amount of money. And even Trump, to his credit, ran a pretty economical campaign. And he showed that you can win, or you can get a pretense or a kind of victory without spending the same huge amounts of money. So I'm less worried about money as an influence. But I am worried about the entire process. So let me borrow from Lenin, who wrote this great book once called What Is to Be Done? And what he wanted done was a communist revolution, in which he was successful. I ask, what is to be done in the United States? And what is not to be done? Here's some things I think you should not do. I think you should stop signing petitions. I don't think Congress is, people in Congress are very persuaded by petitions. I think you should stop giving money to every group that comes along through your email and says, just send us $5 and we'll leave you alone. until we ask you for $100 next time. What I think you should do is refute the fantasies of Trump and apparently Congressman Smith about the massive amount of fraud that affected the election. And that ought to be a constant reiteration. Every time there's a fantasy presented, somebody ought to write a letter and say, where are you living? But the focus really has to be, and this is the great thing about the Indivisible movement, the focus has to be on political change rather than these gestures such as petitions and $5 contributions. The key thing, it's very simple, is registration of voters and getting voters to turn out. And of course, in between, to persuade them in a position. The way to win power and protect democracy is not through dollars, it's through shoe leather. And that's the great weapon. TV is less important than it used to be. Social media are more important, and the key thing is the knock on the door, the friendly knock on the door to persuade people to vote. 2018, there's a chance to change a lot of this. Most governors will be elected in 2018. You can elect governors who will not support voter repression. Most state legislatures will be voted on in 2018, and ours, of course, will be voted on this year. It is conceptually easy to do this. It's physically hard. Conceptually, it's simple. You win, you protect democracy by getting more votes. It's very, very simple. And eventually, Congress can be changed in 2018. Also, the special election in Georgia yesterday, I think, ought to be an encouraging action. And Democrats almost winning 50% in there with a good chance of winning the seat indicates there's a real popular movement going on in the country which can reverse this. So that's where I would put the emphasis on this vital issue.
So that related to that, because we're talking about, future looking in terms of what can be done in the next election cycle, there are also people who are concerned between now and then, like that November 2018 feels a long way off to a lot of folks. And so something that we talk about a lot in Indivisible is resisting right now, and putting pressure on right now. Especially when it comes to things like conflicts of interest and divestiture. And so when we are calling out fantasy, as you noticed, as you mentioned, one of the other things that we've thought about doing is just continually calling out the conflicts of interest that haven't gone away, that we haven't gotten resolution on. And Dan's gonna pose a question that came from the audience on that related topic.
Okay, so Andrew Sherwood sent in a question. He's unavailable to read it because he's coming, okay.
He's our photographer?
He's our photographer, videographer.
And videographer,
largely
and
responsible
he does amazing video work.
So in response to an inquiry that I made back in January, Congressman Smith sent me a letter saying, like you, I believe it is essential that Congress conduct its business efficiently and effectively to earn, secure, and maintain the trust of the American people. No one is above the law, and elected officials must work double time to avoid even the appearance of impropriety.
So those were Congressman Smith's
That was a very courageous position.
Yeah. Those were Congressman Smith's words, and some other constituents had written in and asked, should we be worried about the nepotism that's at work? Should we worry about Trump's reversal on saying he would release his taxes? But they're all related to this same idea.
Well, some of this may get kind of too detailed, and if so, just yell and say, get off
Yell.
Conflicts of interest are very narrowly defined in the law, and that can be a problem. It's a conflict of interest if I'm on a board that hands out liquor licenses, and you come before my board and you've given me a carton of the greatest scotch that exists in the world, and then I vote on whether or not you should get a liquor license. But for the most part, that's the way conflict of interest statutes are written. And so that's not really the whole problem. And even on that, the enforcement of conflict of interest statutes in this administration will be made by this administration. And you have to be a great believer in the tooth fairy to think there's going to be rigid enforcement or going very deep into this. If there's a presidential conflict of interest, or what looks like a presidential conflict of interest, the law specifically exempts the president and vice president from these laws. So you have to put that aside. But what really bothers me is not that individual stuff. I'll get back to that a little. But the broader conflicts. Corruption can mean different kinds of things. And one thing it can mean, and used to mean in the 19th century, was the corruption of the entire system. That the system was corrupt and fundamentally flawed, rather than just the individual. And part of that kind of corruption is families taking over the government for family interests. So it bothers me, the president's exempted from these laws. Who's not exempted from these laws are his children, who are now, two of them at least, are employees of the federal government. And it bothers me, conflict of interest, and one of those children is trying to get business access in China, and at the same time, she is meeting with the president of China in a meeting with the president of the United States. And that's a problem of a broader conflict of interest. But it goes even beyond that. There's a word I only recently learned called kleptocracy, which is sort of rule by the super rich. And a lot of our government begins to look like a family business in South America, with excuses, with apologies to South America. The super rich as a ruling class worry me. The huge number of lobbyists who have become appointees of this administration in cabinet appointments, for example, but also in regulatory agencies. Now, this is not a single direct conflict of interest. It's not the liquor payoff that I mentioned before, or a person who's in an oil company making a decision on deregulation, environmental regulation of oil and oil drilling. But it's more general than that. It's the oil lobbyist who's now in a position who's making regulations on coal and energy policy in general, and is making it from a certain kind of class and policy perspective. Now, what do we do about this? Well, presidential conflicts, for example. You talked about tax returns. Well, tax returns, of course, are confidential, and releasing tax returns is a crime if you're an employee of the federal government. At the same time, President Trump's going to be proposing, one of these days or months, tax reform or tax alterations. How do we know that those tax proposals, those tax changes, will not particularly benefit the president's own economic interests, real estate in particular? We don't know where he makes his money specifically, and we can only find that out through the release of his tax return. So we've got this problem. And then on top of that, I don't know how many of you care about emoluments, which is an obscure word in the Constitution.
Lots of vocabulary, probably more vocabulary than you expected for a town hall. We've got kleptocracy, emoluments.
But the Constitution bans any federal official, including the president, from getting anything of value from a foreign government, a title, money, etc. And that was because of the way things were in the 18th century. That clause has never been explained or presented in court before the U.S. Supreme Court. So we don't know how far that goes. And How do you find out? How do you bring things to the court? You file a lawsuit. But in order to file a lawsuit, law, the U.S. law anyway, always requires that you have some harm that you're concerned about. You can't just bring a lawsuit and say, I don't like President Trump, you know, his hair is bad. And so you have to bring a case that says he's caused me individually harm. Well, what harm can come to an individual from the president accepting a gift from a foreign government? So it's unknown. Now, one thing that people are trying is, one of the things Trump has done is build a hotel in Washington. One of the things foreign governments have been doing is renting rooms in the hotel or banquet halls and so on, which brings money to Trump indirectly. And people are arguing that that's a gift from a foreign government. Who's harmed by that? Interestingly, a couple of hotels in Washington have now brought or joined the suit against Trump, saying by his getting business, he's hurting our business, and so there is direct harm. Now, whether the courts will accept that or not, I don't know. What I do know, and this is my conclusion here, is the real way to handle this is not legal matters. They'll go forward. The real way to handle this is by political action. The thing I really admire about Indivisible is its emphasis on political change and political action rather than some of these more complicated kinds of approaches. The tax returns are never going to be released voluntarily. It may be that the Russia investigations will hint at an economic benefit to the Trump family, and that may justify a valid subpoena to get those tax returns released. That may happen. The DC hotels may be successful in doing this. But if you really want to increase pressure and relieve the conflicts of interest, the only real solution is changing the people who can call for that. And political action, again, congressional elections are coming, and this can be done.
We have a question from Claire. Claire Tundro.
Hi, Jerry.
Hey, Glenn.
All right. As a nation, our politician stances have become more and more polarized, and partisanship has won over cooperation. As we all know, there are some people in the Republican Party who are very proud of that. What could the GOP-led Congress do to restore cooperation in our government? And I turn the same question to the Democratic Party, because filibustering Gorsuch's nomination to me seemed like a much less good idea than having been proactive and applying real pressure so Merrick Garland had a full confirmation hearing. I'm pretty sure there's a high road somewhere. Who in government is going to find it and take it?
So Jerry, what norms have we seen flouted? What rules bent? What rules broken, not just by the president, but also Congress? What is at stake?
Well, those are great questions, and two colleagues of mine in political science wrote a book a couple of years ago called "It's Even Worse Than It Looks," talking about Congress. And then they wrote a newspaper article a year later saying, it's even worse than we thought when we said it's worse than we thought. I have the nostalgia that I think you reflect for the good old days when there were norms in Congress in which people behaved more nicely, in which they were friendly toward one another. And I went back and looked at a classic article on the norms of the U.S. Senate. And in preparation, very quickly, there was 6 norms that this author talked about. Apprenticeship, when you became a senator, you didn't shoot your mouth off, you learned the job. Second one, specialization. You stuck to what you knew instead of covering everything. Third, legislative work. That was your focus, to be a workhorse and not a show horse, as they said. courtesy as a thing. They criticized Elizabeth Warren for not being courteous. In those days, everybody was courteous. Reciprocity, another norm. I do you favors, I recognize your interests, you recognize mine. And finally, institutional patriotism. Patriotism about the institution itself, whether it's filibustering or courtesy or allowing time for debate, people were committed to that. And the striking thing is, all 6 of these norms are no longer in operation. And that's much more important, the lack of norms. We live by norms more than by rules. There are things we do because don't do because that's the way you're supposed to behave, even if somebody hasn't written it down in a formal rule. Those norms have gotten greatly weakened. Why? It's not just Mitch McConnell or Harry Reid. There are fundamental political forces that have undermined them. One is the media campaigns. It is so expensive to get elected to office. You got to find people who are going to give you a lot of money, or a lot of people who are going to give you a little bit of money. And how do you get people to give you money? Not by saying, I'm a moderate, isn't that nice? It's by saying, I'm a fanatic on your issue or your set of issues. So that hurts. Another reason is that people who are going into government are more ideological than they used to be. People used to go into government to make a buck, and sometimes that made them corrupt. Now they go into government because they believe in ideas. And as a professor, let me tell you, sometimes ideas are not good things to be in favor of. And the third thing, and I think the underlying thing, I've even got some chart if anybody wants to see, is that voters have gotten much more ideological. It used to be that the bulk of the American electorate, on a scale of 0 to 10, would be in positions like 5 and 6, in the middle. It would be like, you've heard about this normal curve, punched in the middle. That's changed. The American electorate has changed, and they're now at one end or the other, and the middle has shrunk enormously. One of the reasons, in turn, for that is that the leaders have become more ideological, and they teach the voters how to be ideological, and they teach them the language and so on. So you got to change the voters in some way. It's not going to happen by itself. And here's a couple of hints. One thing is people, and this includes you, ought to get deeply involved in primaries. Don't wait for the general election. If extreme candidates, however you want to define it, are defeated in primaries, they won't be around to be in Congress and cause these kinds of problems. I think people ought to go against Ted Cruz kinds of Republicans. And I think they ought to go against Democrats who believe if you're not pure on 20 out of 21 issues, you don't deserve to have a Democratic title. Most of you have read the Indivisible Guide, I think. And Theda Skocpol, professor at Harvard, just puts it very well. She says, you don't have to agree with everyone, with a person on everything. What you have to agree with is that it's better to elect A than B, and work together on that, even if you don't have total agreement. So, on strategy, I don't think Democrats should cooperate in Congress until they get something for it. The big issue is now health care and Obamacare. And I think Chuck Schumer is exactly right, that the Democrats should not come to any conciliation or cooperative meeting until Trump or Ryan or somebody says, we accept the basic outline of Obamacare. Now let's talk about improvement. For the longer run, we could talk, this is abstract political science, we could probably change the primary system if we had so-called blanket primaries in which voters chose 2 candidates, not necessarily a Republican or a Democrat, but across the entire field. We might get more moderate candidates. Maybe we should be talking about proportional representation, but that's way off in the sky. And the first thing is to get the bad guys out in primaries or in elections and then let them talk about compromising.
So several constituents wrote in on the topic of dialogue with our representatives. So this is sort of an amalgam of all of those questions. So several constituents asked a question that amounts to, why isn't Chris Smith here? As we know, he hasn't held or attended a public town hall in 24 years. He has suggested that it's not necessary as he interacts with his constituents all of the time. Does refusal to participate in a town hall meeting violate democratic norms? What should we be doing about this continued refusal to engage?
Well, it's an excellent question. It's very difficult to answer. I always like the definition of democracy as talk. The process of democracy is talk. And anything we can do to promote talk among ourselves, with our representatives, that's a furtherance of the democratic principle. Now, how do you get people to talk when they don't want to talk? I think the solution is not a very good one. I think the solution is harassment. I don't mean physical harassment, but political harassment. At every opportunity, in a polite way, if possible in a humorous way, there ought to be things that say, why can't you talk? I mean, I don't know how to do this, but you know, skilled video people and creative people can come up with things. Gags, statues, you know, mock pictures of people who won't talk with gags on their mouths. I think it should be done humorously if possible, certainly courteously and non-violently, but that's what I think you have to do. I think we ought to invite Congressman Smith to things like Congressman Pallone's speech on Saturday. Frank Pallone is the Democratic leader on health care, the ranking member of that committee. I think as a courtesy, you ought to invite Congressman Smith to say, Congressman Pallone's going to be talking about health care. You're his colleague. We'd like to hear other views. Come and present your ideas on health care. Promote that kind of dialogue. But in the end, I'm getting to sound like a broken record, the main point is re-election. Congressmen have one goal, really, a re-election. And when you threaten their re-election, they get very cooperative. And that's why I think Congressman Smith came out against the Republican health care bill. He saw even in this district, which of course has been set up to assure his re-election, even in this district, there was a threat. The more that threat is perceived and pushed, the more cooperative I think he's going to be. And I would have, you know, advertisements, radio announcements are cheap. I would contrast his attitude toward with Congressman Frelinghuysen, another conservative Republican who was opposed to the health care bill earlier or more vigorously, more obviously. And ultimately, probably you have to defeat him in order to get him to talk. And then he will probably give a concession speech.
So our time with Dr. Pomper is limited, unfortunately, although he will stay for the remainder of the program. And so if anyone wants to come up and chat with him, we can. I'm going to ask him the same questions that I've asked all of our speakers, and I will be asking all of our speakers, as well as you'll see these reflected in the videos. You saw some in Dr. Kellerman's video. But it's 3 parts. First, I'd like to know, you know, what haven't we talked about yet, right? Like, what concerns you the most about the president specifically, since he's taken office, something that we haven't asked about? Secondly, if Chris Smith were here, what would you ask of him to do? And then finally, what gives you hope?
Well, what concerns me most is the process itself. Even the day after Trump was elected, when I was in traumatic shock, I wrote a newspaper op-ed that said, well, some things Trump has said might not be so bad, infrastructure. And other things would be bad, but they're reversible. I think Obamacare is generally a good system. But if it were repealed, that would be a bad thing, but it could be reenacted the next time the Democrats are in power. So there are lots of things in politics that can go back and forth. There are two things that, in policy terms, that worry me about this administration, but this may be my concern. I worry about climate change. I mean, that is not reversible with the new administration. And of course I worry about war, in which case none of us may be renewable very long. Democracy is not an inevitable system. We see in Europe even how the democratic system is threatened. We see in Trump threats to that throughout the campaign. 70% of his campaign statements were rated as lies, an incredible percentage. The use of violence, the threat of violence, the focus on I alone can do this, and that's a kind of authoritarianism. The denigration of the electoral process, and Dan Kellerman also referred to, when you not only say you want to win this election, but it would be illegitimate for somebody else to win it, that's very threatening. So those are my fears. What would I ask Congressman Smith? I don't really know him. I would ask him, you know, the most obvious thing is, tell us what you believe and engage in the dialogue. You know, this is what the whole thing is about. Beyond that, you can have whatever beliefs you want. He made his reputation first as a very avid pro-life congressman. It's a position I don't hold, but I understand and accept that some people do sincerely, conscientiously hold that position. And fine, let's talk about that. But we do have to talk about it. What gives me hope is this room. My favorite, one of my favorite authors, and my students, you know, have gotten sick of it, is Alexis de Tocqueville. And if you go back and read Democracy in America, Tocqueville was not a fan of democracy. He just thought it was inevitable, so he better understand it. But he said the thing that makes America work as a democracy is that people are involved and they learn through associations how to be citizens and how to prevent the government from becoming tyrannical. And he talks about political associations, you know, I'm staring at one right now, as great free schools. Great free schools. I love the phrase, in which people learn to be citizens. And there's a section in which, at the end, I was trying to locate it, couldn't earlier, in which he says, you can be prosperous, and America will be prosperous, and so on. But if people forget about the associations with one another, if they don't care for one another, the second part of this program today, they may be prosperous, and they may be comfortable, and they may live happily with family and friends, but the conclusion will be that they have lost their country. As groups like this, they give me hope that we are not going to lose the country, and the country is going to get revived. I'm really happy to be here, and so happy that you're here. Go out and use up some shoe leather and get some right people.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Campbell. So we've gone from the international to someone who's an expert on the American context, and now we're going to bring it even closer to home to give us time to transition between the first and the second halves of our program. We have a series of video interviews that we conducted to kick off the second half of our program, which is called Protecting Each Other. When we asked our membership for some ideas about what's concerning them, what do you want to see at a town hall, there were many concerns that all fell under this umbrella of protecting each other. We heard a lot from people who said, this does not apply to me, but I am scared for people in my community to whom this does apply, and then there would be something there, right? There would be, I am afraid for my aunt who is a member of the LGBT community. I am afraid for my neighbor who is in danger of losing health care. I am afraid for the immigrants in my community. And so when we have the panel coming up for the second half of the program, we tried to summarize some of those questions. But before we get to a formal answer, we wanted to show you the faces and let you hear the voices of your friends and neighbors here in the 4th District who are members of those communities and who are more vulnerable today than they were before Election Day. And so with that, we have a video to queue up. We call it Town Hall Neighbors.
Hi, I'm Patty.
I'm Jackie. We live in Lakewood. Been here for 8 years. We like it here. It's peaceful. There's all the world outside, but you don't know that when you're in here.
I grew up in Toms River.
And I grew up in Bound Brook, which is Somerset County. I went to school in Massachusetts. I lived in California for a long time, and then I came back to watch my family grow up and to meet Patty, but I didn't know that.
I've always thought that being an American was having a big heart.
It means believing in the values I think we're supposed to represent.
This is the land of opportunity. That's what I believe.
When I came out, it was scary to be gay. And then it got better, it seemed. And now I'm afraid it's going to get that way again. I have a lot of nieces and nephews, and a lot now great nieces and nephews. They're young and they're precious. And I was excited that they could see their aunts be married and consider that normal, like they do for their aunts and uncles. And now I wonder what they're going to learn.
I wish Congressman Smith would show up at a town meeting. He prides himself on being a Catholic, but...
I was raised Catholic too. I was taught nice values like love your neighbor as yourself.
And that means even your gay neighbors.
But I would ask him really to look at what's going on in the world and stop worrying about being a Republican or a Democrat and do what he thinks his God would want him to be doing.
My name is Hazim Yassin. I'm the president of the American Muslim Action Network. We're a socio-political organization in Monmouth County that's focused on raising the profile and increasing the engagement of the Muslim community with politicians, elected officials, government. When you don't have somebody in the room kind of speaking to your perspective, you can't expect other people to understand that perspective. You can't even expect other people to bring up that perspective. Well, a lot of them, as I mentioned, they come because they're coming from oppressive regimes with very poor economies. Number one. I mean, they come here just like anybody else comes here for the American dream, to make a life for their family. That's the number one everybody finds. They want to make a life for their family. What worries me is when you have the president and when you have leaders spout this rhetoric, about this anti-Muslim rhetoric, or racist rhetoric, or misogynistic rhetoric, and it just becomes normal, and then society takes their cue from that. And when I see specifically our Congressman Smith, Republican, he doesn't stand up to his own party leader who's making all these derogatory comments. It's akin to being complicit and saying, okay, you're okay with it. That's perfectly fine with me. And that's not right. I have the biggest problem. What are the consequences of non-involvement? I mean, I'd say we're kind of seeing it right now, especially with the rhetoric from up top. We've seen people murdered, especially you've heard the Quebec shootings. We had situations in Carolina. We're seeing mosques being burned down. It seems to be a monthly kind of ritual at this point. And we, especially in the Muslim community, we have a huge issue of artillery bullets in school. They filled it with garbage and then they poured it on our lawn, and we had to come clean it out. It was like garbage and like glass and stuff like that. The worst stereotype of the Islamic faith in the community is our oppression of women. I mean, okay, so I'm on the board, the Islamic American Muslim Action Network. The entire board, except me, are all women. Business owners, lawyers, doctors. I mean, these are prominent members of society. And I picked them, and part of the reason they're on the board is they're considered community leaders. The second one would be that we're supposed to hate or we hate non-Muslims. I mean, anybody who's actually read our holy book knows that we're supposed to treat everybody equally and kindly and fairly. Like, I'm sitting here, I'm not attacking you. I didn't wish you died or anything. I just trying to break it. Like, it's so laughable.
So my name is Kevin Dixon. I'm 17 years old, almost 18. And I go to Communications High School. I'm going to be a senior. And that's about it, I think.
My name's Dave Dixon. I've been in New Jersey since I graduated college, and we've been in this house since way before the kids were born, so whatever that is, 20-something years. Perfectly healthy family with no big issues, and during his freshman year, he developed some problems in his hip. And after going to many doctors and rounds of therapy, they finally diagnosed him with
Juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. So every week I get a shot of Humira, which is like $2,000 per shot.
And at the point that it actually hit, I mean, the kid, this one, he's a surfer, skateboarder, avid video guy. He videotapes all his skateboarding thing with his friends. That was his life.
And now with Humira, I can do what I want, and I can walk down the stairs without like wincing in pain and sliding down the railing.
So, being able to maintain this disease in a way that he can actually be out and back to surfing, doing the things kids ought to be doing, it's important.
Well, I don't think there's really any way somebody could pay for a medication that expensive that frequently.
So at this point, I'm currently covered by COBRA, which will expire in July. ACA would be the only way to be able to get any kind of affordable health care. I think the idea that the federal government steps in and tells them that they have to buy something that doesn't apply to them is part of what drives them nuts. I pay school taxes through my property tax, and most of the people who are across the street in retirement village, they don't like that. But somebody was paying those taxes when their kids were in school.
If Chris Smith were here, I would just want him to be able to promise me that I'm gonna be able to have the medicine that I need to live my life the way I want to. That's all I ask of him.
It's great that he's worried about the Medicaid piece of this, but I'm more worried about all the other pieces they're looking at. Taking away the standardization and a lot of the other stuff, to me, makes absolutely no sense. Forget about repealing, start thinking about improving. That would be a good thing to do.
Dan's going to invite our panel speakers to the stage, but I just want to point out that the Dixons are actually here tonight. They're down front. I want to thank them very much for sharing their story with here and everyone watching online.
Okay, so Dwayne Proctor, PhD, is an independent citizen and free thinker who resides in central New Jersey. Dr. Proctor is a trained communications scientist and former Fulbright Fellow who received all of his degrees from the University of Connecticut. After teaching at the University of Connecticut School of Medicine, Dr. Proctor moved to New Jersey and accepted a position at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. In his adolescence, he joined the Poor People's Campaign, and later in college, he became a member of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. As an adult, Dr. Proctor is a lifetime member of the NAACP and serves on the NAACP Foundation's Board of Trustees. The views he expresses are his own and are based on his personal experiences and his academic training. So let's give a round of applause for Dr. Proctor. Carly Rothman-Sadisky is the Director of External Affairs and oversees the New Jersey Policy Perspectives Development, Marketing, and Community Engagement efforts, and administers the Kathleen Crotty Fellowship. Prior to joining NJPP in September 2014, Carly was Director for Social Media at the Star Ledger. Previous roles there also included editorial board member, online editor for Opinion, reporter, and web editor. Carly also served as public education manager for the Food Bank for New York City and has served as an advisor to nonprofit organizations on communication strategies. Carly holds an MPA in Public and Nonprofit Management and Policy from the Robert F. Wagner School of Public Service at New York University, where she specialized in financial management and public finance. She also holds a BA from Yale University. Having grown up in poverty in Camden County, Renee Kubiatis is deeply committed to identifying and breaking down barriers that prevent many people from meeting their basic necessities for themselves and their families. Renee has been an advocate and community organizer, helping disempowered populations use their voices towards social change throughout New Jersey for over 14 years. Renee currently serves as the executive director of the Anti-Poverty Network of New Jersey. Renee previously served as the advocacy coordinator of the National Association of Social Workers New Jersey chapter and the assistant state campaign director for the Citizens Campaign, a statewide nonpartisan movement of hundreds of citizens dedicated to innovative government reform and promoting citizen leadership. In her various roles over the last 13 years, she has educated thousands of people on issues of poverty, leadership, and civic engagement. Renee is a licensed social worker in New Jersey and holds an MSW from Temple University and a BASW from Rutgers University. Dr. Sarvmeet Kanwal is an adjunct professor here at Brookdale Community College, where he teaches astronomy and quantum physics to science and engineering students. He had class right before this, he rushed right over. Previous to becoming an educator, he retired from a distinguished career in the telecommunications industry, working first for AT&T Bell Labs and then Lucent Technologies. Through Brookdale's lifelong learning program, Dr. Kanwal has also been helping to promote science literacy within Monmouth County's adult population through teaching short courses on popular and contemporary science topics. Outside his college teaching role, Dr. Kanwal is a board member of the Monmouth Center for World Religious and Ethical Thought and a co-founder of an award-winning multi-faith youth education and leadership program called Mosaic, which stands for Mobilizing Our Students for Action to Build Interfaith Community. Last June, Dr. Kanwal was presented with the Earl Thomas Teasley Humanitarian Award by the Monmouth County Human Relations Commission for his positive impact on bridge building across different sections of our community. During the last few years, Dr. Kanwal has been frequently invited to speak to diverse audiences on interfaith-related topics and also to inform them of his own faith, Sikhism. Fred Buglione is the executive director of the New Jersey Coalition for Inclusive Education. He has a long history of success in education and educational nonprofits. As a former teacher and school administrator, Fred developed inclusive educational environments that helped to ensure that all students succeeded. He has held director-level positions in nonprofit organizations dedicated to educating students with disabilities of all ages. Fred is a skilled educational and nonprofit leader who has raised student academic achievement in every educational program that he has overseen. Fred has an MA in English Literature and a Master's in Education.
So thank you, first of all, to all of our speakers, and thank you to everyone who submitted questions under the Protecting Each Other banner. Necessarily, the questions were far-reaching and covered many, many topics. We worked hard to try to summarize them by topic, and so the questions that I'm going to be presenting represent, an amalgam of the concerns and the individual questions that came up. I assure you, though, that all of your individual questions were given to the congressman directly, one by one. So you may recognize some of your questions here, or pieces of them, but understand that when we delivered your questions to the congressman, we passed them along as you gave them to us. So we're going to start with the topic that the Dixons actually left us off with, and that is healthcare. It was the topic of our last town hall, and so it seems an appropriate place to start with protecting each other, because certainly none of us is immune from the need for healthcare, right? And so I'm going to put this to the panelists. I know a few of you had offered to speak on this specifically, but what can or should our elected officials be doing to create an equitable healthcare landscape for all? What about down at the state level? What would the real world impacts be of some of the proposals that we've seen so far? Who would like to take this to start?
I'll start. I've been part of the New Jersey for Healthcare Coalition for the last 3 years, and have been part of some of the congressional town halls and vigils that have been hosted around the state with Indivisible and New Jersey Citizen Action. And there have been over 800,000 people who have gained insurance coverage in our state, both through the Medicaid expansion and the subsidies. So currently in the proposals that have been floated, those people would lose coverage. And I think somebody talked about, maybe in the video, you talked about the standards that were implemented as well. And so some of those include, a ban on pre-existing conditions, ban on annual lifetime benefit caps, no-cost preventive services and screenings. Also, a big part of the Affordable Care Act was making sure that people with mental health or substance abuse issues were covered. And our governor keeps talking about the opioid crisis and what he's doing to stem the tide of that. But all of that won't happen if nearly 1 million people lose coverage in our state. And so this is a real critical issue for a lot of people.
Sure.
Can you hear me? Great. First of all, thank you so much for having me and us. It's a real privilege to be here representing New Jersey Policy Perspective. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank based in Trenton that for 20 years has been fighting for economic justice in New Jersey by driving policy change at the state level. With about 1/3 of our state budget coming from federal dollars, that necessarily includes understanding and relating to what's happening at the federal level. And healthcare is one of our main verticals of research. And I brought some of the figures from the reports during this last fight, culminating in the victory over the Trump-Ryan healthcare bill. Temporary, but we have to celebrate success while we have it, while we stay vigilant. But in the 19 weeks between when Trump was elected and that decision, NJPP waged a deliberate campaign to make the facts matter about that bill, which included 3 reports that detailed the impact of repeal on the state. And some of the figures that came out of that research, 1.1 million residents would lose benefits, which included 212 seniors and disabled people who would lose their drugs through the Medicare donut hole. In the marketplace, we had 289,000 residents who would lose coverage. Under the Medicaid expansion, 550,000 adults would lose access to Medicaid. But beyond, and in addition to, on top of the direct impact on people who would lose their coverage, the state gets $4.2 billion in federal funding for these services. The impact on our economy and the ripple effects of that on families would be enormous. 86,000 jobs would be lost with the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. So the impact would be enormous, not just on the families most directly affected, but also on the many people who serve those families in the healthcare industry.
There's one other person on the panel that spends an awful lot of time thinking about healthcare equity.
I really do. I spend a lot of time thinking about it, and my colleagues at RWJF work on it. And I was so glad to hear the introduction. It made it clear that I'm here today as an independent citizen, that I can speak freely, and that things I say are not a reflection of my employer nor my affiliation with the NAACP, although they help shape who I am and my perspectives. And the issue of access to quality care, we should all have access to quality care. There should be no barriers that stops us from having access to quality care, no matter where we live, no matter who we are, no matter what our income is. Everyone in this country should have that opportunity. It was Martin Luther King Jr. who said of all the inequities in the world, the most severe is that of healthcare and not having healthcare. It's very important. But as I read the papers and I hear about hospitals turning away people because they don't have the right insurance or they don't have the right kind of insurance, and someone making that decision to send somebody away so that they can go to a different place, perhaps it's more difficult for them to get there. Perhaps they can't afford to be there. Perhaps their health condition is so severe that going someplace else does not make sense. I call it healthcare apartheid. It's a way of shutting some people out and letting others in. And when you have an apartheid situation where you have systems that are set up to do exactly what they are designed to do, then it's up to people to stand up and say, we need to fix the systems that are affecting these outcomes. But the approach to doing so is one that calls for political action, as we heard earlier today. It's the best way to protect ourselves and protect our democracy. And that political action should focus on the issues of equity, making certain that this equity exists for everyone, even though the greatest concern may be for our communities, wherever they are, may be concerned for what happens in terms of dollars within our states and our towns and things along those lines. Whenever we see inequities, being able to stand up and point to it and say, this is wrong. Doing it in the newspapers, writing op-eds are great things to do, writing letters to the editors of newspapers when these stories appear. And the more and more voices that start to call for a different vision of how our healthcare systems can work, then you'll start to see the change that comes along. But it takes being on top of it when you see it. So if you see a story in the paper and it says, this group of people, whether they're African American, Latinos, or others, are not welcome at these particular hospitals, being able to just say it, say that this is wrong, even though it may not be of direct concern to you, you'll pull in partners that way, you'll make your voices known, and as you're standing up for others, you'll be standing up for yourselves.
So I'm glad you touched on the economic insecurity piece, because that was definitely another theme that emerged from all of your questions. And not just with respect to, economic security in terms of employment, but just in general, the impact of the federal budget on the well-being of the poor and other underserved populations. We've seen a draft budget. It's been floated. To those of you who've looked at it and sort of understood the impact on the most, vulnerable among us economically, to what extent do things like public education and healthcare, as you mentioned, community programs, public transportation, and even things like PBS and the NEA, to what extent do they rely on federal dollars when articulated here in the state? And what would the real impacts be to New Jerseyans of cuts in those areas?
I'll start. The challenge to our economic security presented by this administration is enormous, for sort of a broad reason, and then some specifics I'll get into. For the broad reason, we are a state that needs to be on offense on economic security. We are a state that is experiencing historic highs in income inequality. Mm-hmm. We are a state where our sputtering economy is leaving working families in the dust. We have a shredded safety net that is letting families who need it slip through. And our organization, as Advocates for Economic Justice, we were priming for an offensive battle to improve the systems we have. We were hoping to restore the funding that Governor Christie cut to help with heating assistance for low-income families. And now we're fighting for that program's very survival at the federal level. Last year we published a paper talking about TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. New Jersey has not adjusted the level of assistance for poor families raising kids under this program in almost 30 years. I mean, the value of that program, it's dwindled, it's sand. And now, so instead of being on offense, we are now having to fight to maintain a completely inadequate status quo. So that's the sort of the big picture. And in terms of some of the specific issues, As I mentioned earlier, this is a state where about a third of our budget, about $17.4 billion, comes from federal funding. We are also a state, thanks to 20 years of financial mismanagement that is the fault of both parties, this is a bipartisan issue, is on the brink of financial collapse. We are just a few short years from being unable to meet basic services and obligations. So we've experienced 11 credit downgradings under Governor Christie alone, in part because our rainy day fund is insufficient to cover shortfalls in our tax collections. So imagine if the Trump Dream budget were approved and we lost this major sources of federal funding. It could be a real, we're in a very insecure position. And speaking specifically about the Trump skinny budget that was mentioned, that Jennifer mentioned, that proposal included cuts to many programs. There was a 13% cut proposed to transportation and education programs, 18% cut to the National Institutes of Health, about a 31% cuts to programs for environmental protection. So major numbers. But there were also programs that he slated for complete elimination. And to highlight just 4 of them, one was the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program that I mentioned a little while ago. That program, LIHEAP, helps approximately 800,000 low-income New Jerseyans, including many seniors, pay their heating bills. We received $116.3 million in the 2016 federal budget. Could be kaput. The Community Development Block Grant, which supports housing, economic development, and social service projects, mainly for low and moderate income New Jerseyans. That's $81.3 million we received in the 2016 federal budget. Again, up for complete elimination. Home investment partnerships and community services block grants, which provide $24.5 million and $19.2 million respectively in the 2016 federal budget to develop and preserve affordable rental housing and repair of homes of low-income homeowners, and also to provide funding for local governments and nonprofits to provide anti-poverty services. So again, we're talking about housing, we're talking about anti-poverty programs, we're talking about heating, and I think, let me just check my number, I don't want to get it wrong, but I think it was $250 million that we'd be losing through these cuts. And that's, again, those are just the ones that are slated for complete elimination.
Sure. And another one that's slated for complete elimination is legal services, which is really critical to folks who are fighting an unfair eviction or foreclosure on their home and things like that, because we already have the highest foreclosure rate in the nation still. But I'm glad you also brought up TANF. Actually, it has been 30 years since the TANF benefit level was raised, and it was 1987, the year that my family was leaving welfare in Camden County. It wasn't enough to survive on then, and it's worth half of what it was in today's dollars. I don't know how people can even manage, even if they're getting other types of assistance. But I also wanted to kind of take a step back and talk about where we are as a state. You talked about some of the dire situations that we're in, but also the interconnectedness of all of people's basic necessities. If the Dixons lose their health care, that would certainly set them back on meeting all of their other financial obligations for basic necessities. We have to think about everything together in terms of housing, education, healthcare, food, transportation, and economic opportunity. Because if you lose one thing, if you have a major car repair or high utility bills in the wintertime, it sets you back on everything else. The current New Jersey minimum wage, which just went up on January 1st of this year to $8.44 an hour, is below what is considered federal poverty level in this country. Even if you're making up to $9.29 an hour, you're still making below the federal poverty level and qualify for at least food assistance. The New Jersey housing wage, estimated by the National Low-Income Housing Coalition for the average two-bedroom in our state, is $25.62 an hour, working full-time year-round, to meet your housing and all of your other basic necessities and not be struggling. We've also had issues for years and years of redlining and zoning that push poverty into all of our small, medium, and large urban areas across the state. We did a report last year, in May of last year, that you can find on our website. And these communities are now faced with the greatest need in terms of all the people facing poverty in their communities with the least amount of taxes and revenues because of all of the corporations that have left and gone to neighboring municipalities. And they're stuck with what we call the eds and meds, who don't pay taxes to the community, right? And so the ALICE report, if anybody knows what that is, it stands for Asset Limited Income Constrained and Employed. Just came out from the United Way of Northern New Jersey in January of this year. The updated numbers shows that 37% of people in our state are struggling to make ends meet and can't meet all their basic necessities. That's more than a third of people in our state. And one of the major issues, in addition to the housing and the need for the continued and even increased assistance for housing for people both federally and in the state, because we've also defunded many of our housing programs in the state for the last 7 years under Governor Christie, is that folks are really struggling. We have a minimum wage that is so low that people can't survive. 9 of the 10 occupations that employ the most people in our state make well below that housing wage that I mentioned earlier, and much closer to that minimum wage that we currently have. And so between the two things, I think housing, certainly if we lose the health care, and the economic means to get by, we're crippling people and working families.
And I think the interconnectedness of these issues are really important to keep in mind. And how you message this as you do your organizing, as you go out to make your arguments and bring in more partners and more people to join you. There's 2 things on income insecurity that I think are really important to get across. Number 1 is fair pay for women. Making that argument. Women raise our children. Many women are raising our children by themselves. Many grandmothers are raising our children as well. Being able to make that statement, and if all the women in the room feel comfortable standing up, please stand up. Look at the power of having women in this room right here. And there's no reason whatsoever why so many folks, and please, you can sit down, thank you for indulging me. There's no reason why we should have that type of discrimination going on again. And when you see it, we should be able to say something about it. So I'm not going to belabor that point, but I will add just a couple more facts here. The second important thing about income insecurity has to do with poverty in particular. 11% of New Jerseyans live in poverty. 15% of our children live in poverty. So if you took these 3 rows right here and go all the way back, these columns right here, this is about 11% of the room right here of families who are, by government standards, living in poverty. By government standards, you take these 2 sections of the room right here, this is all your poor people, still not making enough to pay for their homes and to also buy food. So the problems that we have in New Jersey are big, and they've been here for a while. If we were talking about TANF before, the amount of money hasn't changed in 30 years. 30 years ago, I was 22. I don't know what I was doing. I think I was cooking or something like that. And I know that I could not live on that salary that I had 30 years ago today. And yet, we have our poor families in New Jersey having to live with that. Being able to tell the stories of those people, being able to use examples like saying that if you look at a room this size, and being able to graphically depict these things for folks will also help draw people in. And it doesn't matter what background they are, because they will be drawn to the compassion. No one in this room wants anyone to starve, right? There we go.
And I can't think of a population that inspires more compassion than children. You mentioned the number of children in New Jersey who are living in poverty, and certainly as questions emerged about vulnerable people, children in general, and definitely children in public schools, were mentioned over and over again as someone for whom we are all concerned, right? And here's a little bit of a bright spot. This is something that came out of the questions, is that poor children in New Jersey academically outperform poor children in every state except one, Massachusetts. So that's a good thing. But the reason, and one of the main reasons that happens, is because we had, for a long time, and I think that we should keep it, a supplemental per-student funding that was sent to districts with large student populations who are poor, or who are learning to speak English, or where maybe there's a disability present. So what should we be doing from an education policy perspective to ask our elected representatives to maintain that and improve upon that?
Can I say something?
Yeah.
I'm not an expert in education, though I am a teacher, but I do understand that without access to federal money and without access to some of the programs that we currently rely on, there's a lot of people in this state who would not be able to get an education, which we all feel is a necessary part of democracy. If there is any area in which we want equality, it is in education, because that is where we start our lives. And if we don't have equality in education, we're never going to have equality, in the grown population. And so I fear very much that if we do not continue to sustain and perhaps even improve on the funding for people in underprivileged populations in school, disabled children who require much more money for educating them than others would. If they're left behind, the kind of damage that would do to our society is close to unrepairable, in my view. So it's a very important area in my mind.
And Fred, I mean, this, thank you. And Fred, this is something, again, you spend a lot of time thinking about this.
Yeah, I do spend a lot of time thinking about this, and I spend a lot of time in districts in Newark and Trenton and all of these high poverty areas, and it's interesting how the school funding formula topic gets framed in the media as being wasteful spending. They're wasting the money. They're spending it on these lavish things or misspending it in some way. It's not being of any benefit when it's very clearly of great benefit. And there is a much larger need for additional funding for services to kids with disabilities, English language learners, all sorts of at-risk students. And what they fail to mention in these conversations is the impact that it has had. That in New Jersey, poor children academically outperform every other state except Massachusetts. That the funding actually is working. Mm-hmm. That additional funding is needed, not to have it stripped away because there is the sense that someone is getting something that they didn't work for or earn or be born into. This is a country where we're supposed to be supporting each other across the board. It's where we're supposed to be helping each other. This funding has been in place for many, many years, and it's been under threat for many, many years, and they continue to threaten it back. When it was the Abbott districts, they challenged it, and now in the current formula, they're always challenging it, but it's desperately needed, and when I'm in these districts, I can assure you, I don't see every student with a laptop. I don't see administrators going out to lunch on the company dime. I see administrators trying to figure out how to attract and hire enough teachers just to cover the classes they need. I talk to administrators struggling to ensure that all students with disabilities get the appropriate services they need. It's not being wasted, and more is needed.
And if I could just add really quickly, so you were talking about the framing of the funding right now for poor students. It reminds me also of the way we've framed Head Start programs in recent years. Head Start is probably arguably one of the most successful federal programs we've had in our country.
I was a Head Start kid.
Okay,
me too.
Great. And it was intended to prepare kids for school in many different ways and not necessarily educationally. It was supposed to socially prepare them. It gives them hot and good nutritious meals during the day, so at least they're getting that nutrition even if they aren't at home. It provides health care, connects them to dentists, and we all know now that Oral health is very connected to our overall health, but we didn't know that then, but it's been doing that for a number of years. It provides employment for some of the parents who are participating in Head Start as well. So it provides all of these basic necessities, again, to help kids get ready. But unfortunately, during the Bush administration, I remember that it was being attacked because it didn't educationally prepare students. And now we have a lot of state legislators also talking about community schools. And it's basically the same kind of idea. If we could just look at Head Start, we'd be a lot better off.
So, yeah, thanks for bringing that up, especially, I think, there are lots of issues where we don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater and reinvent the wheel. We've had good ideas. They've worked in the past. And just because it's not politically popular to align yourself with those previous ideas, they don't get revived. I think that's I echo Dr. Pomper's concern about this, I alone can do it. No one alone can do anything. And there are a lot of really smart people and really hardworking people who've been thinking through these policies for a long time and found good things that work. Fred, you touched briefly on students with disabilities, and I'll say that as a parent with children in the public school system, one of the most concerning first things that I saw after Betsy DeVos was confirmed was the IDEA website came down, that portion of the resources for parents and for students with disabilities. And that act, that 2004 Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, required that school districts provide age-appropriate curriculum to students with disabilities. And with that, we started to see new ideas, like new things come forward, new evidence-based interventions that are still compatible with standards-based classrooms. So what can we expect from a Betsy DeVos Department of Education moving forward on this particular topic?
That's a fairly scary question to answer. So IDEA guarantees students with disabilities equal educational access and the support they need to be successful in general education classrooms. So that helped precipitate a move towards evidence-based practices in education in general. We want to make sure that anything we're doing in the classroom has a research base showing it works well. And what we found is that teaching students with disabilities really is good instruction for all students.
Mm-hmm.
So when we're talking about supporting students with disabilities, we are always talking about supporting all students. Some of the initiatives that have come through the years, the multi-tiered systems of support, which currently the New Jersey Department of Education just released their version. It is New Jersey Tiered Systems of Support. We'll brand everything here. But it's a whole school model. It's for the support of all students. Her inability to understand that IDEA was a federal law at her hearings is, of course, quite a bit of a concern. At the same time, the recent Supreme Court case that upheld and expanded the requirement of school districts under IDEA was reassuring in this time of uncertainty. And what the Supreme Court found was that public schools cannot just do the bare minimum for students with disabilities. They have to ensure that the students receive similar progress in the general education curriculum that other students, typical students, would receive. So it puts a high burden on the school systems to really support students with disabilities achievement. And one of the things that I don't know too much about DeVos's politics or ideas beyond that. She's a fan of school choice. And school choice sounds good on when you say it. Well, everybody wants choice. But I work with students with disabilities. And when somebody says school choice, that means that students with disabilities have less choice. If you look at charter schools and the public schools, and we'll take Newark, for example, 18% of the students in Newark public schools are students with disabilities. When you look at the charters in Newark, between 8 and 10% of the students there have disabilities. If you write that you have a disability on that application of that charter school, I can pretty much guarantee you're magically not going to get accepted. That student choice forces the district to have a much higher proportion of students with disabilities than they would normally if the charters didn't exist. So you wind up creating special ed districts. You wind up creating public school districts for the cast-offs and the unwanted and the students that charters deem uneducable. And that means that you've just lost all the choices in the world. So I'm not a huge fan of school choice. So it is quite the concern.
It's really interesting listening to this. And I wasn't there when it happened. I was born 9 days before Kennedy was shot in November 1963, okay? I wasn't there when it happened, but I heard about Brown versus the Board of Education. And this has been solved, okay? The Supreme Court said there will be no separate and unequal schools. And if we have these commercial schools versus public schools, and the commercial schools are sending out the cast-offs, using that term, and making a special place for others to be there, we are creating a separate and unequal school systems for children, okay, for our children, our future, those that we need to do well. And so a lot of this ground has been plowed, but as you all are starting to form and organize and move, pulling back and thinking about the roads, the obstacles that have already been knocked down and holding them up, because this is a civil rights issue. And there's no reason why our families should have to struggle to find ways to accommodate their students without public school systems as well. And so thinking about that media framing that you mentioned, Fred, thinking about how all this news about the wasted money going into public schools and things like that, well, I think that for a population, that might put a bad taste in people's mouth about continuing to pay taxes and support public schools. And so then the alternative would be to have these commercial schools where sometimes the teachers aren't certified. We just heard that special needs kids aren't wanted or allowed. We know that that if you act up while you're in a commercial school, they will dismiss you, so the only place you have to go back to is a public school. With all these things in place, the equity issues, once again, for every issue that that all of us are concerned about, looking at the equity issue is really, really important, because that frame will always help us get further together when we say, you know what? It's just not equitable. It's not right. It's not right. I'm so glad you said everything you said.
So
I do want to just add one thing. Where'd you go, Jeff?
I'm here.
All right, you're over there. The way that charters sometimes frame success. Now, there was a charter school in New York City, I believe, and 50 kids it was a middle school, so 50 kids graduated from this middle school every year, and they all passed all the tests, and they had a 100% graduation rate because the 50 kids that started 8th grade graduated 8th grade with great marks. What they didn't say in the publication was that the school was from 6th grade through 8th grade, and they admitted 150 kids in 6th grade and kicked out 100 of them.
There you go.
Before they started 8th grade. So their graduation numbers were based on the number of kids starting in 8th grade. They didn't count the 2/3 of the kids that they kicked out already. So it's amazing what you can do with numbers when you know how to game the system. Mm-hmm. I'd say nationally, charters are showing in my mind, not a significant improvement over public school achievement in many areas.
So I'm glad that we're talking about education as a civil rights issue, because it certainly is. And for many of us who are concerned with losing the ground that was gained when so many important advances were made on the fronts of civil rights, now is a very concerning time. When you start thinking about civil rights for all and diversity and inclusion. And I mean, I know this is a question that also is a theme that emerged from the question that were submitted, but that many people are concerned by the increase in both the frequency and the virulence of hate crimes since the beginning of the 2016 election cycle. Not that this hasn't been around for a long time, but a lot of things were brought to the forefront. For example, the defacement of houses of worship and Jewish cemeteries. Very recently, there was a man in Washington State who was shot in his driveway. The SPLC has been tracking a spike in everything from leafleting and rallies of known hate groups to assaults and murders of members of religious and racial minorities being investigated as hate crimes. As we think about our landscape, our hope for an inclusive and diverse nation, what can we say about these things, and what can we ask of our elected representatives to do?
Yeah. I was born in India, and I came to this country almost 40 years ago. One of the reasons that I decided to settle down here, other than the fact that I was, as many other people, wanting a better standard of living, which the American country does give. But one of the main reasons why I wanted to settle down in this country is because I really had admiration for the people and the values of this country. I loved the fact that people here valued liberty, they valued individuality. They had real respect, I thought, for diversity and for tolerance in terms of various religions. It was something that really attracted me, and it was definitely very different from where I grew up. And while I started to live in this country, I did start to notice that there were some groups of people who didn't have these values. I specifically remember the time of the Iran hostage crisis, and definitely even more remember the time of the 9/11 terrorist attack. There were people that I encountered who didn't quite feel the way that I thought the mainstream felt, and they did made me feel, and also many other minority communities in this country, they made them feel not welcome and so on. But even then, I always felt that the mainstream of this country had their heart in the right place, and it was a matter of making more progress in those areas. But last fall, with the election results, I really felt as if the rug had been pulled from under me. It was a shock and a daze, and I started to feel very different from what I had felt all along while I've been in this country. And that is not just me. I'm aware of many other communities that have undergone the same feeling and are feeling a lot more threatened. I actually have to think now if I'm going in an area where I'm going to be safe or not. I never, ever used to think that way at all. And I think that one of the reasons why I'm here today is because I feel that something has to be done. It's a little bit as if, if your loved one falls sick, you do everything you can to bring them back to health. I kind of feel like that about the country today, and I want to do whatever I can to bring it back to where I think it should be, the way that I had always imagined it to be. Thank you.
We have so many questions we could keep asking. There were literally just dozens that, again, there's no possible way that we could cover them all, every topic. I assure you each of them was submitted to the congressman. But now I'm going to ask the panel to do exactly what we've done, had all our speakers go. We're going to start with Fred and go down the line. I need you to answer 3 questions for me. The first is, what concerns you most from the executive level? What concerns you most about the president? And that can be executive orders, cabinet appointments, general rhetoric. The second is, if the member of Congress that represents you were here today, in our case, if Congressman Smith were here, what would you ask him to do or say in response to those concerns? And finally, what gives you hope?
So what gives me hope? I'll start that because I love starting with the good stuff, and I'll get to the other stuff. What gives me hope is that we're from New Jersey. We root for the Jets, and we just survived a bunch of years of Christie.
Very basic, love it.
So we're all kind of used to a little bit of suffering, but I have firm belief that the Jets will again win something, anything at this point. Maybe they could put 2 games together back to back, it would be great. As far as the rest, I really just hope that the good work that's happened in the Department of Education at the federal level continues to happen. They've been a huge proponent under the previous presidency of equality and civil rights for all. They've really promoted inclusion of kids with disabilities in the schools and have grant funding for pre-K through 2nd grade inclusion programs. I think they've done a lot of really good things. I would say to you as an audience and to anybody else who asked, that continuing this process, continuing to include people, continuing to see people with disabilities as your neighbor and your community member and somebody who contributes in a positive way to your community is what I would hope and what I would seek. And to be good to each other, and thank you.
Before I came to NJPP, I was a journalist. I worked at the Star Ledger for almost 8 years. I was on the editorial board. That's actually how I found NJPP, because they kept submitting op-eds, and I kept saying, oh, it's NJPP again. And then I joined an institution whose one-time motto and still our values are that facts matter, and that our job is to make facts matter. So my entire career has been based on making facts matter, either as a journalist or as a policy person. So the thing that has scared me most about this administration and the campaign is this idea that we could possibly live in a post-fact world. And so, I live in the west side of New Jersey. I am not in Representative Smith's district. If I were here, if I could speak to him as a human being, I would say thank you for his vote or decision not to vote on that healthcare bill, because what that did for me was restore this glimmer of hope that facts can still matter. 3 days before that vote was canceled, NJPP released a report that broke down the impact of repealing Obamacare by congressional district. And what we found was that the Republican districts the constituents in Republican districts would face disproportionate harm. The percentage losses were greater in Republican districts. That seemed to change some minds, which was heartening. And so, I would say, just in closing, Dr. Pomper pointed out earlier that we have a gubernatorial election this year. Every single state legislative seat is up for grabs. So we all have a chance to make the facts matter in a big way right now in the upcoming primaries and in November. Whatever we do here is going to be seen as a bellwether for the rest of the country. So we have a responsibility not only to elect leaders who might pull us back from the fiscal cliff, this financial cliff that we're standing on. Let them know that we're watching as they make the decisions that can make the difference of whether we fall into chaos or are pulled back to safety. But also send a message to the rest of the country that New Jersey is standing for the facts and standing on our values and going to hopefully start a wave. Thank you.
So I'll start by saying that in terms of the current administration, I think somebody said this earlier, we've lived through lots of bad policy from both political parties. If Hillary Clinton had gotten elected, we as advocates would have still had a lot of work to do, right? And I'll answer the first and second questions kind of similarly in terms of what I'm afraid of from the current administration and what I would ask a congressional representative to do. Certainly all of the cuts that Carly talked about, to not make those cuts. I've met with our legislators in Washington over the last few weeks, and many of them have assured us that they're working to make sure that doesn't happen. That is a wish list from the president, and so I'm hopeful about that. The other threat, and something I would ask any representative from New Jersey to stand up for, is there was a leaked executive order in January from President Trump about expanding the definition of what a public charge is, and therefore eligibility for a lot of different programs to meet basic needs. And so if that language is changed, a lot of immigrants would be excluded from being able to get the services that they need to survive.
That's right.
So I really want to talk about that, but we've always just really had the barest minimum of a safety net in this country. We haven't really had what we need to provide everybody in this country, their basic necessities. One more thing before I talk about hope. So the proposed budget from the president talks about a $54 billion increase in defense spending and a similar $54 billion decrease in a lot of the cuts that we've talked about for programs and services for people. When we hear about defense spending increase, and this happened right after the war in Iraq, when the Bush administration greatly increased our defense spending, most people assume it's for the military or for currently military actions that we're doing. I happen to have lived with a defense contractor engineer for over 20 years, and I can tell you when we increase defense funding, billions and billions of dollars go to things like what my husband's developing, which won't even be in use for 10 to 15 years from now, and which have no bearing and impact on any of the current threats that we have in our country. At the time of the Iraq War vote, I asked Congressman Andrews in South Jersey this question: do we really need these things when we increase spending at that time? And he said, no, not at all. Here's how you deal with North Korea, here's how you deal with Iran, and he went through all of the major threats that we had in the country at that time and still do. And so we need to really be talking about what our priorities as a nation are, right? We have the means, we have the money. It's just we don't have the priority for guaranteeing basic necessities to the people of our country. And so that's what needs to change. What gives me hope is the goodness of people, when they really have a good understanding of what people face and the truths of poverty and other oppressions in this country. And I would go back to what Dr. Pomper said, and also has led by example in his own civil service in terms of getting involved. There's a Greek word where we got idiot from, which is idios. The original meaning of idios in ancient Greece is someone who is not involved in their local community and not part of the decision-making and making sure that our communities benefit all people, right? And so beyond voting, that's a great way to express yourself, but get involved. There are lots of boards, appointed boards and commissions at the local, county, and state level on the issues that you're concerned about. You can run for your local political party committee seat at the local and county level, and that's where a lot of power is wielded in our state. You can go to your local council meetings, go to your county freeholder meetings, and get involved and express your voice there as well. Thank you.
I would like to start with the last question too. Where do I get hope from? I get my hope from history. Some people may not realize that we've been through times like this before.
Yes, sir.
In fact, in 1921, Congress decided that, because of the unions and the politics and so on, they decided that they would shut the immigration in this country because that was hurting jobs and so on. Well, after a certain amount of time, it was all reversed, and it was the immigrants that came after that that resulted in so much of the building that has happened in this country. So things can change. I also want to quote someone from my community, a young lady, who actually gave an address on the New Year Day this year at a black church. And her final statement I find very, very comforting. She said, "What if the darkness that we are experiencing today is not the darkness of the tomb? What if it is the darkness of the womb? That maybe we are ready for a rebirth which will drive us to a place which is even better than what we have today." Thank you. I do want to say the thing that irks me the most about our current situation and our current president is the divisive rhetoric. I think that damage is not very easy to quantify, but what it is creating in our country, the kind of emotions that are coming up as a result of that rhetoric are really sad. We all know that there are more people in our country that want pluralism than those that want divisiveness and division. And so I think that there is only one way that we can get out of this, and that is by standing up for each other. We cannot sit quietly. When we hear that somebody in our community is being threatened or is being the butt of a remark that we don't think is the right thing, we cannot be silent. We have to get up, we have to do something, we have to say something. And I hope that we'd go even beyond that, that we would start groups, organizations that will in fact, over a period of time, go against the wave that seems to be coming in our country. We must do something about it. Thank you.
Dr. Proctor, make it count.
I'll make it count. I'm so impressed by everything that I've heard, and I can only kind of add to this, because what concerns me about this administration, all of our elected officials, is that they speak for us. They speak for us. They speak for us. And people listen to them as if they're speaking for us. And most of the times, we don't even know what they're talking about, which direction an armada might be going. It confuses folks. And it's bad for our national reputation in so many different ways. And to think about all the lives that have been lost to make America the great country that it already is, right? All the turmoil that as a nation we've gone through to make this nation as good as it is. It's in the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. I'll let the lawyers tell me. But isn't our job as citizens to make America a more perfect union? Right?
Yes.
Right. And I don't know that what we're doing right now is getting us to that point in particular. So I'm very concerned about our reputation, and I'm very concerned about the mixed messages that we're getting from our elected officials. I'd like to pick up exactly where Dr. Conwell left off too in terms of hope. This has happened in our history before. It has. And each time, there's one solution that's worked, okay? It happened after the Civil War, where poor African Americans who were just released from slavery, alongside poor European Americans who lived down south, funded by rich European Americans that lived in the north, started to rebuild the South. They started to rebuild the South. They started building roads. They started building schools. They started building public buildings, and they had them desegregated, and this was going to be a new South down south, and guess what? There were some folks that didn't like it, and they started a political campaign, and they started pointing to others, those folks down south, as causing trouble, okay? They started saying that we need to do things, literally said, we need to make America great again. They literally said that, okay? And then they said, we're going to lower taxes, and we're going to cut out the program so that we can stop their progress in particular. Okay, that was right after the Civil War. And remember, there was this Supreme Court justice called Harlan. They used to call him the Great Dissenter, because some of the things that were happening and coming before the Supreme Court were the antithesis of what it meant for the American ideal. And so he was known as the Great Dissenter because he tried to stop them, but he couldn't stop them, and they took political power. What stopped them? Fusion coalitions, where groups of people who wanted to see change came together with other groups of people who wanted to see change, right? Okay? Regardless of what their primary mission was, they came together and they started to make change again. And we had what we called the beginning of the second Reconstruction. The first one was immediately after slavery, right? So the second Reconstruction came along. Our military was desegregated. Our schools became desegregated. We moved into the 1960s and saw the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, okay? All of these things came together, and then we had another elected official who was looking to gain the highest office in the land, and he was told that, you know what? If you want to win this election, all you have to do is take the southern states first. Okay, that gives you 170 electoral college votes. Now I'm in 1970 right now, right? Okay, 170 electoral college votes, and then you can gain the other 90 you need from the rest of the country if you speak like George Wallace. You don't have to say what he says, but you have to say things that sound like what he says. The South will hear you. The South will hear you, and all you have to do is carry those 13 states down south. And then the other 90 votes that you need, the other 90 electoral college votes that you need can come from the other 37 states, because there's other folks that'll hear you. It'll be a dog whistle. And they said, you know what? The best thing to do is to look at George Wallace's speech that he gave at Madison Square Garden. You can download it. It's online. It's a beautiful piece of work. Okay, it says, it points to another as causing the trouble in our country. Okay, it says we need to cut taxes so that we don't have to have all these expensive programs. All right, it said, what else did it say? Oh, there was a heckler. All right, and the heckler was treated as we saw hecklers treated in the last campaign. Right, it's a playbook. All right, so now we're in round 3. Okay, because after round 2, fusion coalitions came together again and started to maintain and hold and sustain the progress that we had already made. So now it's time for a third Reconstruction. And this is what gives me hope, because when I look at what's going on in North Carolina with the Moral Mondays movement, fantastic work, man. All sorts of people in the streets. Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. And I know intimately the work of the NAACP, very much so. And there's a few things I can tell you. One, you all should join them as members if you're not members. Memberships cost about $30, $35, okay? The group's been around since 1909. We've been organizing, we've been advocating. Our strategy, we educate, we demonstrate, we litigate, and we celebrate. And that's how we do the good that we do. Thank you. There are a couple of dozen NAACP branches in New Jersey, and the state conference branch is very, very strong. I think you should join. I usually give young people, when they graduate from high school, membership to the NAACP. The other thing is, if you think you would not be welcome in the NAACP, you should know that it was founded in 1909 by two Negroes, African Americans at the time, and 4 white people, okay? And 2 of them were Jewish, right? Okay? So we've always been about embracing everyone to go forward. The reason why it seems like our association, my beloved NAACP, is for black rights is that the discriminatory policies at the time were written against black people. But every time we won, all of America benefited. All of America benefited. So as you start your organizations, as you get your organizing together, click up with some of the others that have been doing this for a very long period of time. It'll save you time. You'll get new partners. You will add your power to the power that they already have, and you'll be able to see the change that you're looking for. Absolutely, 100% I guarantee. Because history tells us that. Yep. And again, to the question about the senator, I don't live here either. I live in Mercer County. And so, but from what I've heard here tonight, he doesn't sound like the leader that you all are interested in having. I think that's been made very, very clear. And we heard earlier about being able to organize and use social media. I think I would suggest a hashtag that said, no town hall, no re-election. That's simple.
Thank you. Thank you, Dwayne Proctor, who is the new chair of the Social Media Committee for Indivisible New Jersey 4th District. No. So thank you for answering the question about what gives you hope. We do have one more story from our friends and neighbors, something that we were going to play earlier with friends and neighbors. And then we have asked everyone that we interviewed on our video to answer that same question. So if you'll indulge us, we have one more neighbor, actually two neighbors of mine. I live in Manalapan. We recorded this interview in Freehold. And then you'll hear from many others about what gives them hope.
My name is Rita Dentino, and I'm the Executive Director of Casa Freehold and Immigrant Rights Organizations.
Mi nombre es Miriam Mijangos, soy vicepresidente de Casa Freehold. Mi trabajo ha sido compartir con la comunidad información para mejorar el civismo y también para aprender lo que es el inglés.
Casa Freehold began in 2003 when Mayor Michael Wilson was running for his 25th year unopposed as mayor of Freehold. He ran on that anti-immigrant platform, and I live nearby. I don't live in Freehold Borough, but we were hearing this and becoming increasingly alarmed. I mean, the reality is that the immigrants are a tremendous resource in this country, and there's really virtually never been a problem of too many immigrants in our country. And if anything, in the direction that we're going, we're going to find ourselves hurting. We've already seen situations where crops are rotting in the fields, going unpicked. Mm-hmm. What we're going to begin to see, because we have an aging population in our country, we're going to begin to see, the people that we love who need somebody to care for them, not having that person. And if we make those domestic workers go away, our country will be very hurting.
Yo me vine porque tenía algunos problemas en mi país.
De violencia.
De violencia.
Yeah.
Y yo pues tengo 2 hijos.
No family deserves to live their daily life in fear, and that's what's happening right now. For us at Casa Freehold, now in these times, maybe our primary concern is simply the safety of our families. Most of our families are a mixture as far as immigration status. Some of the people are United States citizens, and some of them are citizens of many other countries. So I would ask you, as my congressman, and I have lived in your district for 35 years, I would ask you, what will you do to keep our families, our immigrant and refugee families here safe?
What gives me hope? Well, actually, I do have quite a bit of hope for our country.
This stuff gives me hope. The Indivisible 4 gives me hope. And efforts like this all over the country, that people are speaking up. And that I like that they're saying we're not partisan, it's not about being partisan. It's about American values and speaking up for this democracy in the way we want it to be. That's what gives me hope.
So, like I said, I started this group about 2 months ago, and the progress we've made has actually been phenomenal. So I didn't expect anything of this sort. But the attention that we've been getting, especially because we now, to be honest, we have a microphone now.
So I think what gives me hope today, is I'm seeing more of our younger kids getting involved.
As much as I've seen other governments slide back into autocracy, and as much as I think we need to be vigilant not to let that happen here, I actually remain quite confident that we won't let that happen.
My hope is that we can keep and build on the good things that we have created in this country.
It might sound a little bit cliche, but I think just the future in general is kind of what gives me hope and gives me inspiration. Like I think I like to see the good in people and the good in things, and I think that everybody together, we have a good future.
Lo que me da esperanza es de que Dios primero, el Senado, puedan como reunirse, tratar de ponerle un poquito de amor y corazón a lo que está pasando.
God is present, in the situation, and can come together and put love into the situation.
The grassroots things going on all over, and that's what's giving me hope. We're not going away, and you're going to have to deal with us.
Right on. Right on.
So, town halls, even those held in absentia, are just one of the things that Indivisible does. The other three pillars of the other three tactics that we engage in are coordinated calls. We have a dedicated legislation and policy team that researches upcoming legislation and helps disseminate that information to you so that we can call our elected representatives and let them hear our voice on pending matters. The other is public events. Where the congressman is, we will be. At the end of March, he was at the Breakers Hotel in Spring Lake. I thought I was going to be inside at a nice quiet brunch. Instead, I was outside at a nice noisy protest. And that's as it should be, because we are not going away. So we have coordinated calls, we have public events, and we have office visits. The congressman has 3 offices in the district, 3 constituent service centers. And for months leading up to the AHCA vote, there were weekly vigils held on Wednesday afternoons that were temporarily on hiatus after the vote, and then there was some illness and some travel. Those are back on. So 1 week from today, I expect to see all you fine people at the Raintree Shopping Center in Freehold. We meet around 4:30. Bring your signs, bring your passion, bring all the knowledge that you have learned today, and come join us for an office visit. We'll be expanding those to the other offices. If you want to get involved, please reach out to the steering committee. We will help you get ready and get mobilized and come and continue to stay in Representative Smith's face, because no town hall, no re-election. So,
Jen?
I'm just going to wrap up with a few short remarks. I want to thank everyone for coming, and for everyone who submitted questions, and for everybody who lent expertise. I hope that many of your questions were answered. I hope that they were answered tonight.
Jen?
But there is one.
We'd like to thank you.
Oh.
Yeah, we would like to thank you for organizing this, all of the volunteers.
Yeah,
Having
thanks, Jen.
us here, for driving this and doing everything.
You guys. Thank you. I am a very public face of something that a lot of people do behind the scenes, so I do not do this work alone. I could never do this work alone. So yeah, I'm on a lot of videos and I'm standing up front right now, but I can only do this because you will be at his office next Wednesday, right? So many questions were answered tonight, but one still remains, and that is, where is Chris Smith? He's not here. He's not here. He doesn't think that we're from his district. Hold up your signs. Where are you from?
Oh, yes.
Howell, Middletown, Neptune, Shrewsbury, Wall, Belmar, Teton Falls, Ocean, Bradley Beach, Red Bank, Robbinsville, Rumson, Manasquan, Shrewsbury, Hamilton. Do we have Hamilton folks? Where are my Hamiltonians? Yeah, Jim Carlucci, awesome. Congressman, if you are watching this, we are not your enemy. We are your constituents, and that means that we are your boss.
Yes. Yes.
I believe that the congressman is not here because he thinks you wouldn't notice his absence. I encourage you all to fill out a wish you were here postcard and tell him exactly what you think about his absence. Drop it off on the door on the way out. We will mail them for you. I think he thinks that you don't care, which is not true, because just look at the passion in this room and the passion in the organizing. And I think that he probably thinks that you're either too lazy or too stupid to kick up a fuss. And that cannot possibly be true, because I have learned more about his constituents in these short months working with Indivisible than he probably has since he took office when I was an infant. And finally, he's not here because he takes us for granted. And I can't think of anything that I hate less than being taken for granted. And that might be, until now, a fair bet. As some people have pointed out, the congressman has won by comfortable margins year after year, but only we can change that. Look at what happened in Kansas. Look at what happened in Georgia, John Ossoff. What used to be considered safe districts are no longer. And we are here to put pressure on Smith not to sign on for the Trump agenda and the parts of it that put the most vulnerable among us at even greater risk. So, I mean, if you look at the AHC vote, we've seen a lot of ads thanking the congressman, but who I would thank is all of you. I would thank all of you for putting pressure on him. I would thank all of you for writing letters and making phone calls and showing up to stuff like this. That's where the thanks should go. So stay active, stay involved, stay angry, stay passionate, and it's going to take me, and it's going to take you, and it's going to take everyone at home acting collectively and rising up and resisting. Thank you, and good night.
Introduce yourself, gentlemen.
Who are you? Yes, how are you, sir? Friends of Christian. Oh, wow. Wow, she was one of my absolute favorite people.